We don't cover US military activity too much on this channel since it gets more than enough coverage from other channels and large media outlets. However, a recent report by Pentagon watchdog states that the Army was struggling to maintain the mission readiness of its Bradley fighting vehicles in Europe. With those vehicles being positioned to defend Poland at the time, it sounded quite interesting, and most definitely has significance to our focus region. So let's take a look at the details of this report and what it tells us about the importance of logistics for today's video. As reported by the website Stars and Stripes on March 20th, the United States Defense Department Inspector General reported that deployed units are confronted with systemic problems when it comes to keeping their armored vehicles in working order. The core issue? A persistent shortage of mechanics and an intense operational tempo. The audit examined a fleet of Bradleys used during the 2023 deployment of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team 1st Cavalry Division in support of efforts aimed at deterring Russian aggression on NATO's eastern flank. It was found that 96 of 117 Bradleys, about 82%, had been initially reported by the unit as fully mission-ready. However, a subsequent joint inspection determined that all 117 vehicles were actually unfit for use and, quote, riddled with mechanical issues. It said that one Bradley alone had 36 different faults, rendering it inoperable despite being listed as fully mission-capable. As a result of the audit, the Army had to pull 97 replacement Bradleys from its pre-positioned stocks warehoused in Germany to equip the next incoming unit's 2024 rotation. The report was quoted as saying, "The Army did not effectively manage the repairs of the BFVs or Bradley fighting vehicles." The report also says that the brigade, upon ending its deployment, quote, improperly reported the condition of the BFVs turned in as fully mission-capable, leaving those same issues for the next unit to deal with. Now, considering that the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team 1st Cavalry Division was operating in Poland at the time, tasked with defending NATO's eastern flank, it's, at least to us, a huge vulnerability and a massive embarrassment. But to understand how this happened, it helps to know how the US Army in Europe operates. Rather than send vehicles from the United States for every rotation/deployment, US Army Europe and Africa maintains numerous locations where key pieces of equipment such as Bradley fighting vehicles and Abrams tanks are stored for use by incoming units. This ensures that forces, either arriving in Europe for planned drills or in a crisis, can quickly get to work using combat-ready gear. In this case, the brigade and its own equipment is based at Fort Hood, Texas. We know that some units deployed to Europe travel with their equipment from the US, but clearly it's not always the case. We're guessing that deploying tanks and IFVs from US bases would ensure that each rotation heads overseas with fully functional equipment. However, arriving in theater to use other equipment appears to be one issue here that has allowed such gaps to form. The Inspector General went on to say in its report that even subsequent Army efforts to repair the 117 Bradleys were problematic. In fact, as of July 2025, only 51 of the 117 vehicles had been repaired to the Army's maintenance standard. Among the initial challenges was a lack of sufficient mechanics within the deployed brigade, which commanders said could increase repair times by 50%. It was also highlighted that service members were spread across multiple locations during the deployment, complicating maintenance work. Even after the brigade had completed their deployment and were no longer using the vehicles, it said that maintenance teams were stretched thin by competing demands that included ongoing efforts related to supporting and equipping Ukraine in its war with Russia. In his own defense, the commander of the brigade told auditors that during the deployment, most of the Bradleys were able to, quote, run, shoot, and communicate, and were therefore deemed mission-capable. The report goes on, noting that the commander stated that the Army's maintenance standard turn-in condition was unattainable because pristine vehicles with no faults is not possible or even desirable in a unit that is deployed and training. The same commander stated the goal while deployed was not to have pristine vehicles, but to maintain the fleet for use. He added that the Army's maintenance standard is an impossible standard because if the BFVs were repaired to the Army maintenance standard, routine use would render the BFVs as non-mission capable. However, the report hits back at this assessment by the commander and says that it, quote, provided a false readiness level and gave the impression that the BFVs would not need extensive repairs. As many active and former service members can probably attest to, textbook regulations and standards are often very different from what's needed on deployment and on the battlefield. Thus, we can definitely understand the brigade commander's point of view. The original report, which has some redactions, points out that there were fuel leaks and cracks among other things. We can see how this would lead to vehicles being officially labelled non-mission capable by maintainers, but acceptable by those actually using those same vehicles. We'll leave a link to the original report down in the video description if you want to check it out for yourself. Trying to explain how such gaps in maintenance could happen, US Army Europe and Africa said units often have insufficient time between training events and their deployment dates for such maintenance. This, quote, severely limits their ability to fully reconstitute combat power, posing a quote-unquote persistent readiness challenge. To prevent this sort of thing from happening again, a forward-stationed maintenance augmentation team has been established that can surge support when needed. The command also said it would comply with the Inspector General's request for a formal study. Again, it's not a great look for the US Army when its mission in Poland and in other parts of Europe should be ready to defend Alliance territory. But then again, many of us recognize the difference between textbook standards and real-world basic functionality. We're not saying that the Bradleys were in fine shape and didn't need any work done on them, but rather we understand that certain things may be deemed as necessary by Department of War/Department of Defense standards, while in reality the vehicles would have performed just fine on exercise or in a real-world combat situation. At the same time, just because such a discrepancy exists between regulations on paper and how things work in the real world doesn't mean that the report is completely useless and without merit. Maybe it's just a fuel leak or just a cracked component, but the report does expose some things that could be improved. As we hinted at the introduction, the report for us highlights the importance of logistics and support units to military operations. Indeed, it's not just a matter of how many IFVs are deployed, but also making sure they are fully fit to fight. Ultimately, the US Army is an absolutely massive machine, and such size and scale sometimes results in things being overlooked. Reports and audits like these are important in identifying and rectifying those gaps so that the Army can truly be all it can be. What do you think of the report? Let us know by leaving a comment.